Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. The roar of heavy machinery drowns out the quiet morning as a massive bulldozer crashes through the final standing wall. Splintered wood, shattered glass, and crushed furniture litter the ground where a house once stood. Dust swirls in the air, the last remnants of a home that no longer exists. A black SUV pulls up, its tires crunching over the debris. The door swings open, and a man in a crisp suit and dark sunglasses steps out. His jaw tightens, his hands clench into fists, but he says nothing. He simply stares at the destruction before him. They had made a fatal mistake. They had bulldozed the wrong house, and the owner, a federal agent who doesn't take injustice lightly, Daniel Carter, had been looking forward to his weekend off, a rare moment of peace in his high-pressure job. His latest assignment had taken him across the country, and all he wanted was to return home, enjoy a quiet evening, and sleep in his own bed. Instead, he found nothing but ruins. His home, his personal belongings, even his classified work documents, everything was gone, reduced to a pile of rubble. Standing among the wreckage, he took a slow breath, letting the reality sink in. There were no emergency notices, no warnings, no eviction orders. He hadn't missed a single mortgage payment, and yet his house had been destroyed as if it never existed. Daniel didn't panic. He didn't shout. He didn't demand explanations from the stunned construction workers still standing around, unsure of what to do next. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and made a call. The HOA had made their move. Now it was his turn. Across town, in a pristine air-conditioned office lined with certificates and framed awards, Gerald Whitman, the president of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association, leaned back in his chair with a smug grin. The sound of his golf club tapping against the carpet echoed in the room as he basked in his latest victory. Another house gone, another blight removed from his neighborhood. Finally, he muttered, sipping from his overpriced espresso, that eyesore is history. A knock at the door interrupted his moment of triumph. The HOA's secretary, Linda, peeked in, her face uncertain. Mr. Whitman, there's a man here to see you." Gerald waved a dismissive hand. "Tell them to take it up with the appeals board. If they didn't follow the regulations, that's their problem, not mine." Linda hesitated. "Sir, I think you should see him." Before Gerald could respond, the door swung open, and Daniel Carter stepped inside. His sunglasses were off, revealing cold, piercing eyes that locked onto Gerald like a predator sizing up its prey. His voice was calm, eerily calm, as he spoke. "I want an explanation now." Gerald barely glanced up, unimpressed. "And you are?" "Daniel Carter, the actual owner of the house your people just bulldozed." Gerald's smirk barely faltered. "I think you're mistaken. The house that was demolished today was abandoned and in violation of multiple HOA regulations." Daniel reached. Into his inner coat pocket, he pulled out a neatly folded document and placed it on the desk with deliberate force. Gerald's smirk faded as he unfolded it. The title deed, Daniel Carter's name clear as day. The house was legally owned, taxes paid, no outstanding violations. The color drained from Gerald's face for only a second before he quickly regained composure. "Well, mistakes happen," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "The demolition order must have been an oversight. I'm sure we can come to some sort of agreement." Daniel's expression didn't change. "An agreement? My home is gone. Everything in it is gone. I don't think oops quite covers that." Gerald leaned back, exuding false confidence. "Look, Carter, these things happen. The HOA had the legal right to demolish properties in violation of community standards. If you feel there's been a mistake, you're welcome to file a complaint." He chuckled. "Good luck with that." Daniel studied him for a moment before leaning in slightly. "You have no idea who you just messed with." Gerald smirked. "Oh, I think I do. You're just another homeowner who thinks he's special." He set down the deed and crossed his arms. "And trust me, we've handled plenty of people like you before." Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood there for a moment as if deciding something. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the office. Gerald chuckled under his breath, another arrogant homeowner who thought he could fight his HOA. He had no idea that Daniel Carter wasn't just a homeowner. He was a federal agent, and this wasn't over. The Oak Ridge HOA board meeting was in full swing, and Gerald Whitman was basking in the moment. The conference room, decorated with cheap plaques declaring preserving order and beauty, was filled with HOA board members sipping coffee and nodding along as Gerald detailed his latest achievement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, standing proudly at the head of the table, "we have finally rid this community of an unsightly property that was dragging down our values. The board made a bold decision, and now our neighborhood is one step closer to perfection." Some members clapped. Others nodded with self-satisfaction. One of them, Steve, a nervous, balding man, hesitated. Gerald, are we sure that house was abandoned? I mean, we didn't." Steve was interrupted by Gerald, flashing his practiced politician smile. "The paperwork was processed. The demolition team did their job. If anyone has a problem with it, they can take it up with our appeals system, and we all know how well that works." The room chuckled, except for Steve, who looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Gerald leaned back, completely unconcerned. "Besides," he said smugly, "what's one house?" Miles away, in a sleek government office, Daniel Carter sat in silence. His fingers drummed against the desk as he listened to his attorney, Sarah Hayes, explain his options. "They've really screwed up, Daniel," she said, flipping through the HOA bylaws. "Of any records that show we targeted his house, find a way to spin this before there was a loud knock on the door." Gerald turned, his blood running cold as a man in a dark suit and badge stood outside his office window. The nightmare had only just begun. Gerald Whitman had spent years ruling the Oak Ridge HOA with an iron fist, crushing homeowners under layers of red tape and threats of fines. He had handled countless lawsuits from angry residents before, and every single time he had won. But this time was different. This time he had bulldozed the home of a federal agent, and now the counterattack had begun. At precisely 9 a.m. the next morning, the HOA office received a cease and desist order. Every board member was legally barred from issuing fines, evicting homeowners, or making financial transactions until further notice. The HOA's bank accounts were frozen, and all incoming payments were blocked. Gerald read the document, his hands trembling with fury. He slammed it on his desk and picked up the phone. "Get me our attorney," he barked. The response he got made his blood run cold. "Sir, our attorney just quit," she said. "She refuses to represent us." Gerald nearly threw his phone across the room. Meanwhile, Daniel Carter sat in his office watching everything unfold with quiet satisfaction. He had spent the last 24 hours making calls, pulling every string he could. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division had launched an investigation into the HOA's finances. A forensic team was already sifting through their records, looking for any signs of fraud. The IRS was combing through the HOA's tax history, and Daniel's lawyer, Sarah Hayes, had just filed a $10 million lawsuit against the HOA for wrongful destruction of property, emotional damages, and violation of federal laws. But Daniel was not just after financial damages. He wanted to burn the HOA to the ground. Back at the HOA office, panic was setting in. The once confident board members were now scrambling to cover their tracks. Steve, the cowardly board member, was sweating profusely as he whispered to another board member, "We need to delete some files. Anything that makes it look like we knew it was Carter's house." Linda, the secretary, bit her lip. "That's illegal," she muttered. "We could go to prison." Gerald slammed his hand on the desk. "Nobody is deleting anything," he snapped. "We don't panic. We fight this." Before he could finish, there was a loud bang on the door. 3 men in dark suits walked in, flashing FBI badges. "Mr. Whitman," the lead agent said, voice calm but firm, "we have a few questions about your financial records." Gerald's face turned to stone. Outside, Daniel Carter stood in the parking lot watching with his arms crossed as the agents entered the building. His phone buzzed. It was Sarah. "You're going to love this," she said. "We just found something big in their records." Daniel smirked. "Go on." "They've been embezzling funds for years. Illegal fines, fake maintenance fees. We've got them dead to rights." Daniel's grip on his phone tightened. Perfect. Let's make sure they pay for every single thing they've done. As the hours passed, things went from bad to worse for the HOA. The boardroom had turned into chaos. Gerald sat with his hands clasped, his mind racing. We're going to get through this, he muttered to himself. We've handled lawsuits before. But then the door swung open, and the IRS investigators walked in. Mr. Whitman, we need to talk about your tax filings. Gerald's hands started to shake. That evening, a nervous hush settled over the Oak Ridge neighborhood. Residents gathered in small groups, whispering. Did you hear the HOA is being investigated? About time. Those crooks have been stealing from us for years. Daniel Carter did this. That guy's a legend. For the first time in years, homeowners felt a glimmer of hope. Meanwhile, in his temporary apartment, Daniel poured himself a drink and leaned back in his chair. He had taken the first step. The HOA thought they were untouchable. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. Gerald Whitman sat in his office, his fingers drumming against the mahogany desk. His once pristine suit was slightly wrinkled, and for the first time in years, sweat beaded on his forehead. The air conditioning hummed softly, but did nothing to cool the rising panic inside him. He had always prided himself on being untouchable. A lawsuit? He could delay it. Angry homeowners? He could silence them. The occasional audit? He had his ways of making those disappear. But this was different. The FBI was investigating. The IRS was combing through financial records. The HOA's bank accounts were frozen, and at the center of it all was Daniel Carter, the man whose house they had destroyed. Gerald had underestimated him, and now he was about to pay for it. At exactly 9 a.m., unmarked black SUVs pulled up outside the HOA headquarters. FBI agents stepped out, dressed in dark suits, badges gleaming under the morning sun. A team from the IRS followed behind them, accompanied by local law enforcement. The entire Oak Ridge community gathered outside, watching in stunned silence as law enforcement stormed the HOA office. A voice carried over the hushed crowd. Holy crap, they're raiding the HOA. Gerald leapt to his feet as his office door burst open. Mr. Whitman, an FBI agent said coolly, flashing a warrant. Step away from the desk. What? You can't just, Gerald stammered, but his words died in his throat as two IRS agents pushed past him and started seizing records and computer hard drives. Your HOA is under investigation for financial fraud, tax evasion, and unauthorized property destruction, the agent continued. We suggest you cooperate. Gerald's face turned ghostly white. Outside, Daniel Carter leaned against his car, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. A group of homeowners gathered near him, their faces filled with a mix of shock and satisfaction. You did this, didn't you? One man, a longtime resident, asked. Daniel simply smiled. Let me just say I don't like bullies. The crowd cheered as another board member was led out of the building handcuffed. Hey, Gerald, someone shouted. How does it feel to get a taste of your own medicine? Gerald clenched his jaw, refusing to respond as he was escorted into a waiting car. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. Over the next 24 hours, the full extent of the HOA's corruption began unraveling. The HOA's emergency fund had been siphoned off for personal expenses. Gerald had been paying for vacations, luxury items, and even his mortgage using HOA fees. Fake fines and fraudulent maintenance fees had funneled millions into secret accounts. Illegal evictions and property seizures had been used to flip homes for profit. But the biggest bombshell came from the IRS. The HOA had been cooking its books for years, underreporting taxes, inflating expenses, and hiding money in offshore accounts. It wasn't just fraud, it was federal tax evasion, and that meant jail time. As the media picked up the story, the Oak Ridge HOA became national news. HOA president arrested in massive fraud scandal. Federal agents destroy corrupt HOA after his house was demolished. IRS confirms HOA funds used to pay for personal luxuries. Gerald's face was plastered across every news outlet, his once powerful reputation reduced to dust. Meanwhile, Daniel Carter watched it all unfold, a slow, satisfied smile on his face. But he wasn't done yet. because now it was time for payback. Gerald Whitman sat in the county holding cell, his once pristine suit now wrinkled and stained with sweat. His lawyer had given him nothing but bad news for the past 2 hours. The charges against him were piling up like unpaid HOA fines. And the worst part? His own board members were turning on him one by one. They were cutting deals, testifying against him in exchange for leniency. He was alone, and Daniel Carter was just getting started. Across town, Daniel stood on a newly purchased empty lot, the very spot where his house had once stood. A local news crew was filming, and a massive crowd of homeowners had gathered to watch. A microphone was shoved in Daniel's face. "Mr. Carter, what's next for you after bringing down the most corrupt HOA in town?" Daniel smirked. "Oh, I've got plans." And with that, the construction crew behind him got to work. Over the next several weeks, the former HOA members watched in horror as Daniel's ultimate payback project unfolded. Instead of rebuilding his house, he turned a lot into a neighborhood park, but with a twist. A giant LED billboard was installed at the entrance, playing looped footage of Gerald being arrested. A memorial plaque was placed in the center in memory of every homeowner who suffered under the HOA's tyranny. A new community garden was set up, free for all residents, funded entirely with the money Gerald was forced to repay. But Daniel wasn't done yet. He bought the vacant HOA office building at auction since the HOA was forced to sell all assets to cover over legal fees. Then he turned it into a dog park, complete with a massive sign out front that read, "Gerald's Leash Free Zone." Homeowners loved it. Gerald, not so much. But the final, most satisfying act of revenge came when Daniel legally dissolved the HOA. No more arbitrary fines. No more corrupt board. No more harassment. Daniel stood before the community one final time. "For years, you all lived under a dictatorship disguised as a homeowners association," he said. "Well, consider this your Independence Day." The crowd erupted into cheers. Fireworks lit up the sky. And Gerald, watching from a small rundown apartment he could barely afford after losing everything, could do nothing but seethe in silence. A week later, a delivery truck pulled up to Gerald's apartment. A single package was left at his doorstep. Gerald frowned and tore it open. Inside was a framed photo of Daniel Carter standing in front of the newly built park, smiling, and beneath it a handwritten note. "Next time, read the deed before you bulldoze a house." Gerald screamed in rage and threw the frame across the room, but it didn't matter. Daniel had already won. The Oak Ridge community was finally free. The HOA was dissolved, the corrupt board disbanded, and the very land where their office once stood was now a dog park named after their disgraced president. The residents had taken back their neighborhood, and at the center of it all stood Daniel Carter, the man who had brought justice to their doorsteps. That evening, Daniel stood on his newly built porch, watching as the community celebrated their victory. Families were outside enjoying their first HOA-free weekend. Kids played in the park, and laughter filled the air. It was exactly how a neighborhood should be. His phone buzzed. It was Sarah. "Got some news," she said, her voice serious. "You're not going to like it." Daniel's smirk faded. "What is it?" "Gerald's out." Daniel stiffened. "What?" "House arrest." His lawyers pulled some strings. "He's not walking away free, but he's not rotting in a cell either. And here's the kicker. He's already meeting with investors." Daniel's jaw clenched. "What kind of investors?" "The kind that want to start a new HOA." Daniel's eyes darkened. Sarah sighed. "A few miles from here, they're looking at some old real estate developments. No official name yet, but I found some paperwork filed under Whitman Property Management." Daniel let out a slow breath. "So he's trying to start again?" "Looks that way." Daniel stared out into the night. For the first time in weeks, he had let his guard down, thinking it was over. But Gerald wasn't done. Not yet. Daniel's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Then I guess I'll have to pay him a visit." As the screen fades to black, the voiceover kicks in. Just when you thought it was over, the fight is just beginning. What do you think Daniel should do next? Should he stop Gerald before he can rebuild his corrupt empire? Comment below, and if you love seeing HOA tyrants get what they deserve, make sure to subscribe. Be sure to like this video and subscribe for more crazy homeowner stories. You won't believe what's coming next. The last shot shows a mysterious document on Daniel's desk, a red stamped file labeled New H Target, Gerald Whitman. Then the screen cuts to black.